The call came in at 4:47 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I still have the missed call notification saved on my phone. I've looked at it more times than I can count over the past year, replaying that moment when everything I thought I knew about my family shattered into pieces. I'm still picking up today. My name is Thomas Hargrove. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years building houses in Phoenix, Arizona, framing walls, pouring foundations, watching neighborhoods rise up from empty desert land. I retired 4 years ago when my knees finally told me they were done negotiating. My son, Daniel, took everything I taught him and built something 10 times bigger than I ever had. By the time he was 38, he was running a mid-size commercial construction firm out of Denver, with 42 employees and contracts across 3 states. I was proud of him in a way I didn't always know how to say out loud. He was my only child. After his mother passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago, he was the only family I had left. So when my phone rang at 4:47 inches the morning, and the screen showed a number I didn't recognize with a 720 area code, my stomach dropped before I even answered. It was a nurse at Denver Health Medical Center. She told me my son had been involved in a serious accident at a job site the previous evening, a scaffolding collapse. She said the word critical, and then she said the word coma. And after that, I stopped processing anything else she said, because the room started tilting around me, and I had to sit down on the edge of my bed and put one hand flat on the mattress just to feel something solid. I asked her one question. I asked if his wife had been contacted. There was a pause on the line. Then the nurse said, yes. They had been trying to reach his emergency contact, a woman named Claire Hargrove, for several hours. They had left 3 voicemails. They had sent 2 text messages to the number listed in his medical file. So far, no response. I told her I would be on the first flight out of Phoenix. I want to tell you something about Claire, because you need to understand who she was before I tell you what I found out. When my son first brought her home to meet me 6 years ago, she was charming in the way that certain people are charming effortlessly, completely, in a manner that makes you feel slightly off balance afterward, like you've been smiling for too long and your face hurts. She was from old Atlanta money, or at least she said she was. She had the kind of manners that come from private schools, and she dressed expensively, and she laughed at all of Daniel's jokes, even the bad ones, and she looked at him like he was something rare and precious. I wanted to like her. I genuinely tried. But there were small things over the years. The way she spoke about Daniel's business, always in terms of what it provided rather than what he built. The way she'd go quiet and cold at family dinners whenever the conversation wasn't centered on her. The trips she started taking alone after their 3rd year of marriage, girlfriend's weekends that stretched longer and longer. I never said anything to Daniel. He was happy, or at least he seemed happy, and I had learned from long experience that fathers who voice doubts about their sons' wives tend to become fathers their sons stop calling. I landed in Denver at 8:15 that morning. I took a cab straight to the hospital without stopping at the hotel. I went directly to the ICU nurses' station, and I gave them my name and told them I was Daniel Hargrove's father. A young doctor, she couldn't have been more than 32, came out to speak with me in a small consultation room with beige walls and 2 chairs that were designed to be unoffensive and managed instead to be deeply depressing. She told me Daniel had suffered severe traumatic brain injury from the fall. He also had 3 broken ribs, a fractured left collarbone, and internal bleeding that they had managed surgically overnight. The brain injury was the serious concern. He was in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling. She told me the next 72 hours were critical and that they needed to make ongoing treatment decisions. She told me they had a consent form that required a family member's signature. I asked her again about his wife. The doctor folded her hands on the table. She said Claire Hargrove had been reached approximately 2 hours ago, finally, by phone. She said that Mrs. Hargrove had been unavailable to come to the hospital immediately and had asked whether she could sign any necessary documents remotely. The doctor said they had explained that was not possible for the forms in question. I sat with that information for a moment. My son was lying in a coma 30 feet from where I was sitting. His wife had been unreachable for over 12 hours, and when she was finally reached, her first response was to ask if she could handle the paperwork remotely. I signed the consent forms myself as next of kin. Then I asked where my son's room was, and I went to sit beside him. I don't have the words to describe what it's like to see your child like that, regardless of their age. Daniel had tubes and monitors attached to him at what seemed like every possible point. His face was swollen on the left side. His hands, big contractor's hands like mine, scarred and calloused from years of work, lay completely still on top of the blanket. I pulled the chair as close to the bed as it would go, and I sat down and I put my hand over his, and I just stayed there. I stayed there for 4 hours. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Claire. She sounded slightly breathless, the way someone sounds when they've rehearsed calm, but underneath it there's something running at a different speed. She said she was so sorry. She had been out of cell range. She'd just heard about the accident, and she was completely devastated. She called Daniel my poor baby, which was a thing she had started doing in recent years that always made the back of my neck tighten slightly without my being able to articulate why. I asked her where she was. She said she was in Miami. A spa retreat, she said. One of those wellness weekends with her friend Stephanie. She said she was already looking at flights back to Denver. I told her Daniel was in a medically induced coma, that he had a serious brain injury, that I had signed the consent forms, and that the doctors needed decisions made about his ongoing care. She said, of course. I'll get there as soon as I can. These things take time to arrange, Tom. You know how it is." I did not know how it was. I did not know how it was that your husband was dying and you needed time to arrange your return from a spa in Miami. I said, "I'll see you when you get here," and I hung up. That evening, Daniel's business partner came to the hospital. His name is Ray Castillo, a compact, serious man of 50 who has known Daniel since they were both 25 and working for the same general contractor. He walked in with his hat in his hands, his eyes red, and I stood up and we shook hands, and then we sat down on opposite sides of Daniel's bed, and neither of us said anything for a while. After some time had passed, Ray said something that I want to be precise about, because it was the first moment I understood that there was more happening than a terrible accident. He said, "Tom, has Claire been in contact with you about the business insurance?" I looked at him. He said that 3 days before the accident, 3 days, he had received an unexpected inquiry from the insurance brokerage that held Daniel's Keyman life insurance policy. The inquiry was about the process for accelerating a policy payout. The inquiry had come through a third-party attorney Ray didn't recognize. When he'd asked Daniel about it, Daniel had gone quiet in a way that Ray said he had never seen before. Daniel had told Ray not to worry about it, that he was handling something, and that Ray should document the inquiry but not respond to it. I asked Ray if he had any idea what Daniel was handling. Ray reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the bed beside Daniel's hand. He said he'd found it that afternoon in the locked drawer of Daniel's desk at the office, in an envelope marked with Ray's name. He said he thought I should read it. It was a letter from my son, handwritten, 2 pages, dated 11 days earlier. I'm not going to share every word of that letter with you because some of it was private in the way that things between a father and son are private. But I will tell you what it said in terms of what I needed to know. Daniel had known about Claire and the man she was seeing for 4 months. He had not confronted her. He had, instead, quietly, methodically, begun documenting everything. He had hired a private investigator. He had consulted with a forensic accountant. What he found in those 4 months was not merely an affair. It was systematic financial fraud. Over approximately 18 months, Claire had been moving money out of joint accounts in amounts calculated to stay below federal reporting thresholds. She had taken out a second mortgage on their home using Daniel's signature, his forged signature. The investigator believed and directed those funds to an account Daniel had never seen. She had named herself as sole beneficiary on a life insurance policy Daniel hadn't known he'd taken out, issued through a broker she had introduced him to 3 years earlier at a party. The man she was with in Miami was named Brandon Shea. He was a real estate developer. He was also, the investigator had determined, the same man whose name appeared on the account where the diverted funds had been deposited. My son wrote in that letter that he was 3 weeks away from having enough documentation to take to the district attorney. He wrote that he knew it sounded crazy and that he wanted to be absolutely certain before he destroyed everything. He wrote, "If anything happens to me before I can finish this, The investigator's name is Gerald Pruitt, out of Denver, and all his files are in the safe at the office. The combination is your birthday. I read that letter 3 times. Then I folded it exactly as Ray had given it to me, and I put it in my breast pocket, and I pressed my hand against my chest for a moment. Ray was watching me. I looked up at him, and I said, "Does anyone else know about this letter?" He shook his head. I said, "Lock Daniel's office. Don't let anyone in. Don't say a word to Claire." Then I took out my phone, and I called the best attorney I knew in the state of Colorado, a woman named Patricia Ewan, who had handled my business contracts for 20 years, and who I had watched dismantle 3 different opposing counsels in a single conference room without raising her voice. Patricia picked up on the second ring. I told her I needed her to clear her schedule for the next 48 hours. She started to tell me about her existing commitments, and I said, "Patricia, my son is in a coma, and his wife is in Miami with the man she's been defrauding him with. I need you now." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds, and then she said, "I'll be at the hospital in 90 minutes. While I waited, I called Gerald Pruitt. He was a quiet, unhurried man who sounded like he had been expecting my call. He told me he had been monitoring his phone since he'd heard about the accident on the news. He told me his files on Claire and Brandon Shea were comprehensive. He used that word, carefully comprehensive, and I understood him to mean they were the kind of files that don't leave room for interpretation or alternative explanations. He said he could have encrypted copies to Patricia's secure email within the hour. I said, "Do it." Then I sat back down beside my son's bed, and I put my hand back over his, and I talked to him for a while. I told him I was there. I told him I had read the letter. I told him I was going to handle it, and that he needed to focus on getting better. The monitors beeped steadily around us. His chest rose and fell. Outside the window, the Denver skyline was going orange with the late afternoon sun. Patricia arrived at the hospital at 6:40 that evening with a leather portfolio and an expression of focused intent that I had always found deeply reassuring. We sat in the consultation room and I walked her through everything: the letter, Ray's account of the insurance inquiry, what Gerald Pruitt had told me. By the time I was done, she had filled 6 pages of notes without looking up. She told me we needed to move on 3 fronts simultaneously. The first was to file an emergency petition with the court to have myself appointed as Daniel's legal guardian and healthcare proxy, given the evidence of Claire's fraud. This would prevent Claire from making any medical or financial decisions on Daniel's behalf. Patricia said, given what we had, she was confident a judge would grant a temporary order within 24 hours. The second was to contact the Denver District Attorney's Office with Gerald Pruitt's files and the forged mortgage documentation. Patricia said the forgery alone was a federal offense. Combined with the pattern of financial fraud and the suspicious insurance inquiry made days before the accident, there was a case for attempted fraud that a good prosecutor could build into something considerably more serious. The third was to freeze every joint asset Daniel and Claire held: accounts, property, investments, before Claire had the opportunity to make another move. I said, "Do all 3. Patricia said she would need to work through the night, and she wanted me to get some sleep because I wasn't going to be useful to Daniel if I collapsed. I told her I would sleep in the chair next to his bed, and she gave me a look that said she had known me long enough not to argue. Claire arrived at the hospital the next morning at 11. I had been awake since 5. I had gotten coffee from the machine in the family waiting room, and I had read Daniel's letter one more time, and then I had put it away, and I had prepared myself for this part. She walked into the ICU looking the way she always looked: polished, collected, expensive. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse, and her hair was done, and she had a small Louis Vuitton bag over one shoulder. She saw me standing in the corridor, and her expression cycled through several things very quickly before settling on grief, which sat on her face slightly wrong, the way a garment looks when it's the right color but the wrong size. She hugged me. I let her. I kept my arms at my sides. She went to Daniel's bedside and cried. They were real tears, I'll give her that, and I watched her and felt something cold and steady moving through me that I don't entirely have a name for, even now. It was not hatred exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you look at a structure and suddenly see that the foundation has been compromised, and you understand that it was always going to end this way, and the only thing left to do is make sure no one else gets hurt when it falls. After some minutes, she stood up and turned to me and asked about his prognosis, what the doctors were saying, what decisions needed to be made. She said as his wife, "I need to be involved in everything going forward." I said, "I know about Brandon Shea." Her face didn't crumble. "I want to be honest about that. She was smart and she was composed, and her face did something much more controlled than crumbling. It went very still, the way water goes still right before it starts moving somewhere else." She said, "Tom, I don't know what you think you know." I said, "I know about the second mortgage. I know about the account in Henderson, Nevada. I know about the Keyman insurance inquiry 3 days before my son's accident." I paused. "I know about all of it." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Whatever you think you have, you don't understand the full situation. Daniel and I have had problems, serious problems. You have no idea what my life has been like." I said, "Patricia UN filed the emergency guardianship petition this morning at 8 o'clock. By this afternoon, you will have no legal authority to make any decisions about my son's care or his finances. Everything has been frozen." Gerald Pruitt's full file went to the DA's office at 9 this morning. I looked at her calmly. "The forgery on the mortgage instrument is federal, Claire. The structured withdrawals are federal. The insurance inquiry, given the timing, and given what Pruitt documented about your communications with Shea, is going to be very difficult to explain to a jury." She stared at me. I said, "I think you should call your attorney." She left the ICU. I heard her heels on the hard floor moving fast toward the elevator. I went back into Daniel's room and sat down next to him and drank my terrible machine coffee and watched the monitors do their work. Patricia called me at 2:15 that afternoon. The emergency guardianship order had been granted. Every joint account was frozen. The DA's office had confirmed receipt of the materials and indicated they were treating it as an active investigation. She said an investigator from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had already reached out to Gerald Pruitt. I said, "What about Shea?" She said Pruitt had been tracking Shea's location for the past week as part of his surveillance and had passed that information to law enforcement this morning. She said she expected there would be activity on that front within 24 hours. It was actually closer to 18 hours. At 8:40 the following morning, my phone rang. It was Ray Castillo. He had seen it on the news. Brandon Shea had been arrested at his apartment in Miami Beach on charges including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and filing false mortgage documents in the state of Colorado. The arrest had been coordinated between Colorado state investigators and the Miami-Dade Financial Crimes Unit. Claire was arrested at a hotel in Denver. She hadn't left the city approximately 40 minutes later. I was sitting next to Daniel's bed when I received the final call confirming both arrests. I put my phone down on my knee and I sat quietly for a few minutes. Through the window of his room I could see a thin line of mountains in the distance, still carrying snow on their peaks even in late spring. I thought about my wife, Daniel's mother. I thought about how she used to say that the most dangerous thing in any structure is a crack you can't see. I thought about how she was always right about things like that. I talked to my son for a while. I told him it was done. I told him that everything he had spent 4 months building carefully and quietly was now in the hands of people who would finish it. I told him that the company was safe and that Ray was running things and that every account was secure and that all he needed to do was come back. 12 days after the accident, they began reducing the sedation. It took several more days for Daniel to become consistently conscious. The first time he looked at me and clearly knew who I was, his mouth moved before any sound came out. He was weak and confused, and the light bothered his eyes. But he looked at me, and after a moment he managed to say, in a rough, barely there voice, "Did you find the letter?" I said yes. He closed his eyes. He said, "Is it done?" I said yes. He didn't say anything else for a while. His hand tightened slightly around mine, which was the same hand that had been holding his for 12 days at that point. And then he went back to sleep. The recovery was long and not always linear. There were complications and setbacks and days that were harder than others. But Daniel's mind had not been permanently damaged, a fact that every doctor told me bordered on remarkable given the nature of the injury. He had significant physical rehabilitation ahead of him, but he was there. He was present. He could think and speak and argue with his physical therapist, which he did with considerable energy and which I took as an excellent sign. He filed for divorce from a hospital bed 3 weeks after regaining consciousness. Patricia handled it. Under the circumstances, it was not a complicated proceeding. What was complicated and what took considerably longer was the criminal case. I want to be clear about something, because I've had people ask me over the past year whether I feel like what happened to Claire and Shay was justice or revenge, as though those two things need to be opposites. I don't think they do. I think when you discover that someone spent 1.5 years systematically stealing from your child while sharing his bed and his table and his trust, and that they escalated that theft into something that required his death as its logical conclusion, then justice and revenge are the same shape. They look identical from where I'm standing. The investigation ultimately produced evidence that prosecutors described as indicating a deliberate plan. The timing of the insurance inquiry, the forged mortgage, the structured transfers, all of it constructed over 18 months with a clear endpoint in mind. The scaffolding collapse that injured Daniel was ruled accidental by the site investigation. But Shay's communications, obtained under warrant, showed a pattern of discussion with Claire about Daniel's workplace habits, the location of the Denver job site, and questions about liability in construction accidents that were difficult to characterize as innocent curiosity. The prosecutors ultimately did not charge them with attempted murder. The evidentiary standard for intent in that direction was one they determined they couldn't meet beyond reasonable doubt. I understood their reasoning, even if I sat with the outcome uneasily for some time. What they were charged with and what they were convicted of was more than sufficient. Wire fraud, mortgage fraud, conspiracy, forgery, insurance fraud. The sentence hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a Denver federal courtroom that was smaller than I expected. Daniel was there, moving slowly with a cane he'll probably need for another year or two. Ray was there. Patricia sat at the table. Claire looked diminished in a way I had never seen her look. The expensiveness that had always surrounded her was gone, replaced by the particular plainness of institutional clothing, and she seemed somehow smaller in it, as though the exterior had been doing more structural work than anyone realized. I watched her face when the judge read the sentences, and I felt nothing that I would describe as satisfaction. Exactly. It was more like the feeling at the end of a very long project, when the last beam is in place, and the structure is sound, and you can finally look at it and know it will hold. Brandon Shay received 7 years in federal prison. Claire received 5 years and 3 months, with the possibility of supervised release after 4. The money was largely recovered. The court ordered restitution from both defendants. The Nevada account was seized. The mortgaged property was untangled through a process that Patricia described as tedious, but ultimately successful. Daniel's business lost some momentum during the months he was incapacitated, but Ray had held it together with the kind of steady, unpanicked competence that only reveals itself fully in a crisis, and by the time Daniel was well enough to return in a limited capacity, the company was bruised but functional. There is one thing I want to say before I finish, because I've been thinking about it since the very beginning of this whole ordeal. Since those first hours in the consultation room with the beige walls, when the young doctor was telling me about induced comas and critical windows and consent forms. When Daniel first came fully back to himself, when he was able to have real conversations, hold things in his mind, process what had happened, he asked me one night, when the room was quiet and the nurses had done their rounds, why I had moved so fast. He said, most people would have waited. Most people would have wanted to confront her first, or confirm things, or he stopped. I told him that I had built things my whole life. Houses, structures, businesses. That I had spent 35 years learning that the moment you see a problem in the foundation, you don't wait. You don't have a conversation with the foundation about what it intended. You shore up everything that's at risk of collapsing. You secure the structure, and then you address the problem directly from a position of stability rather than panic. He looked at me for a long time after that. Then he said, I should have told you sooner. I told him I understood why he hadn't. He was trying to protect me from worry. He was trying to handle it himself, the way I had raised him to handle things. He was also, I think, still hoping he was wrong, hoping that the investigator was going to come back with something that would allow the story to end differently. That hope is not a character flaw. It's what love does when it finally starts to understand it's been deceived. I told him none of that mattered now. I told him that all that mattered was that he was in front of me, talking, with a long and open road ahead of him, that his wife and her accomplice had tried to take from him and failed. I told him that I intended to watch him rebuild everything they had taken, and that I fully expected to be around long enough to be annoying about it. He laughed at that. It was still a little rough around the edges. His laugh, a little effortful, but it was his laugh, the one I'd known his entire life. I drove back to my hotel that night under a sky full of Colorado stars, and I thought about what comes after a crisis, the long, undramatic work of reconstruction, the work that doesn't make for good stories, but is, in the end, the most important work there is. The work of putting things back together carefully, piece by piece, checking every joint, testing every load-bearing point, not rushing toward the finished product but trusting the process. My son is walking without the cane now, most days. He went back to work full-time in the fall. He's taken on 2 new contracts, and Ray talks about him the way people talk about someone who came back from something and brought something back with them, a gravity, a clarity about what matters and what doesn't. I went back to Phoenix in the summer, and then came back to Denver in September, and I've been here since. I'm not sure I'll go back to Phoenix permanently. There are worse places to grow old than a city where your son is rebuilding something and occasionally needs someone to drink bad coffee with in a hospital waiting room, or, increasingly, a good cup in a proper kitchen in a house that is completely, thoroughly standing. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years building things, and I know what a sound structure looks like. I know what it feels like when everything has been checked and reinforced and is carrying the weight it was designed to carry. That's what this is, now. That's what we built,